With the United States coronavirus deaths nearing 2,500 a day and 700,000 cases overall, you may be surprised to learn that a number of economists were quite happy, or at least cautiously optimistic, when they heard that only 5.2 million people filed for unemployment last week. Now, this is down from 6.6 million the week before and 6.9 million the week before that. They argue that, hey, look, this means that companies, businesses, large corporations, they're factoring into their calculations the fact that the government does seem to be willing to intervene. We saw the Federal Reserve cutting interest rates to basically zero. And we've seen, the small business relief package. We saw the large slush fund for large corporations. And so they argue that businesses are factoring this in because they've seen how the government is willing to mitigate the worst ends of this crisis. Unfortunately, though, we did also see this headline run this past week. We saw that the small business loan program, the money is gone. The money which was allocated to small businesses has all been gobbled up. Now, there's a number of reasons for this, the first of which, and the most obvious, being that it was just too small. It wasn't enough money. People noted this at the time. People knew this at the time, but we just had to get it passed, they argued. And so it was acceptable to have large corporations getting way too much money, in my opinion. And, they still have a lot more money to go around. And then small businesses simply not having enough money. That was part of it. And currently it's locked up into Congress. Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell having a bit of a spar. If you ask me, I do think that we will see we will, in my opinion, probably see more money being allocated. It's unclear when, though, currently, as Congress is at home. And again, Mitch McConnell, Nancy Pelosi in a bit of a spar. We'll have to see when it happens. But again, that was part of the reason that it wasn't enough money. But it's also the fact that there was a bit of a loophole. Now, it's unclear whether or not it was a loophole or whether or not it was intentional, but a bit of a loophole here where a lot of restaurants, a number of large restaurant chains, were filing under the small business claim as opposed to filing under the large corporations. We also saw this with a number of hotel chains also. Now, the thing that I found quite interesting here is that Ruths Chris is here. Ruths Chris, really, people were really upset about this one. If you went on Twitter, people were upset that Ruths Chris's steakhouse was getting a lot of small business money. You can see here getting $20 million. Whereas if you actually looked at it, though, there were a number of hotel chains which were much larger in terms of the number of people employed, in terms of just the size of the company, who were also filing under the small business claims thing. But if you looked at it, though, the hotel chains that were filing and that people were talking about were even though they were larger companies, they tended to cater to lower income individuals, or at least they also catered to lower income individuals or lower middle class, as opposed to Ruths Chris, which explicitly caters to sort of upper middle class or upper class individuals. I'm told that it's a really nice steakhouse. Personally, I've never been there, but I'm told that it's pretty nice here. I'm told that it's pretty nice. And so people were quite upset about this. It seemed to conflict a little bit with their sort of moral intuitions that, a small business should be, a small business. It's just your average guy who decided to start a company, start a business. So why is Ruths Chris here? They're catering to high income individuals. So why are they filing under small business? It seems to be kind of misallocation. That was a sort of moral sentiment which seemed to go around. And I think that is also expressed here. When we saw this here, we saw a number of hedge funds were also filing under the small business claim. Now, some people turn around and argue there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. After all, a number of these hedge funds only have a few people employed to them, so they qualified as small businesses. Other people argue that no, this is completely wrong. This is a misallocation because, sure, they only have a few people, but look at the clients who they serve. They serve billionaires and multi-millionaires. So why can't rich people bail them out? Why is the average everyday taxpayer bailing out hedge funds who, by the way, in many ways kind of aggravated a lot of this crisis in the first instance, right? So people were quite upset about this. They were like, the hedge funds are stealing away the small business money. And so I think that it is an interesting kind of moral debate, people sort of looking at this and saying, hey, look, why aren't rich people, have your billionaire buddies bail out your hedge fund? That, why is the average everyday taxpayer doing this? And we also saw a similar moral sentiment here being expressed with Robert Reich tweeting out here. So let me get this straight. Jeff Bezos has grown his fortune by $24 billion during this pandemic, but he still can't afford sick leave to all of his employees. Now, quite interesting here. Quite interesting here. Now, we also saw this here, though. A number of banks are gobbling up people's stimulus checks and paying their debts and fees. Now, there's a bit of a backstory here. The backstory being that Democrats were actually quite aware of this issue. They were aware that banks were going to be doing this. In fact, they explicitly wrote into the bill a provision which would allow the Treasury to write rules against this, write rules, against banks being allowed to gobble up the stimulus checks. But they didn't actually want to go in and write a rule in the bill itself saying that banks can't do this. Instead, as soon as the bill was passed, they immediately, including Elizabeth Warren and a number of state attorney generals, immediately wrote the Treasury saying, look, we want you to write in rules against this. Write in rules to the bill saying that banks can't gobble up stimulus checks. And this was something that really upset me because it just showed an instance of politicians trying to play gotcha, right? So they write in allowing the Treasury to write rules to prevent this, but they don't actually write in the rules itself. Why? Of course, because then when it happens, as they have, we've seen a number of reports of a number of banks taking people's stimulus checks because they have past due debts. Then they just get to turn around and blame Republicans. They get to blame Donald Trump. They get to blame the White House. They get to say, well, hold on, why didn't they write in these rules? Look at all these letters that we sent. And the average person, of course, not having enough information to really know that, hold on, Democrats, why didn't you write in the rules? Now, some people respond to this and say, well, the reason why they did that is because they were worried that Republicans were going to try to block the bill if they would write in rules like that. Guys, look, I think that's a ridiculous case. I'm not even sure that Republicans are stupid enough. I mean, that's definitely a losing battle, right? Like, oh, I'm holding up the bill because I want banks to be allowed to gobble up people's stimulus checks. That's a losing battle. Even Republicans know that that's a losing battle. Now, of course, though, some people argue that there's actually absolutely nothing wrong with banks gobbling up people's stimulus checks. They argue, hey, look, the reason why we're sending this stimulus check is so that people can pay their debts. People can pay the things that they owe. If they owe money to the banks, then there's nothing wrong with the banks taking your stimulus check. Other people turn around and say, no, no, no. Look, the reason why we're sending those stimulus checks is so that actually people can pay for their groceries, can pay for the absolute things that they need. And look, if banks take a loss, then banks take a loss. That's just what happens. We're in the middle of a pandemic. That's the sort of moral argument that we're having in this here. But for all the bad news, don't worry, guys. The stock market is going up. The stock market is completely booming. This week and last week were record-breaking weeks of the stock market. You can see here since it bottomed out here really around March 23rd, stock market has been consistently going up. So no need to worry about anything. The stock market is on the way up. And we saw Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez tweeting out this photo here. This was a hilarious photo, which I'm sure many of you saw. It was going viral. People were sharing around this photo here, again, including AOC. It shows here in the background, Dow's best week since 1938, while simultaneously down here, more than 16 million Americans have lost their jobs in 3 weeks. So, that was sort of the viral photo which everyone was talking about here. Now, some people argue, hey, look, there's absolutely nothing wrong with this. There's nothing wrong with that photo. After all, if people gambling can make money speculating on the fact that the stock market is going to be going back up, that the economy is going to be recovering in a couple weeks, in a couple of months, they're not harming anybody, they argue. And so there's nothing wrong with that. How could there be anything wrong with the fact that people are making money betting on the stock market? Other people, now if you go on Twitter, you just go on Twitter, most people respond to those arguments by saying, actually, no, there is harm in the stock market. And you can, sort of go through their reasons. Now, if I give you my opinion, my position on this is, look, you can argue, and I do agree that the stock market can cause harms, but those arguments are really complicated. They're really, really tricky arguments. They're really, really detailed arguments, and they're not particularly persuasive because they can apply for specific investors, but it's really, really hard to make those arguments that just apply in general. So if you ask me, I think that what's going on here, what's going on when you look at Jeff Bezos making $24 billion, when you look at people being upset at Ruths Chris, when you look at people being upset at the hotels making money, I think that what's going on here is that there's a general moral sentiment which says that, look, during a time of crisis, during a time of pandemic, we should all come together. We should all work together in order to get through this thing. We should all sacrifice when it comes to the $1,200 check. People are upset mostly because banks aren't willing to take a hit. They're more worried about padding their bottom line, making sure that, they get those $1,200 checks to cover their debts, than they are worried about sacrificing and being willing to take a hit. And people are just upset about that instinctually, just a deep moral intuition that, look, this is a crisis. We should come together and everyone should be willing to sacrifice. And so when they look at this image, when they look at this picture and say, hey, look, why is it the case that some people are profiting while so many other people are suffering? I think it just rubs people the wrong way. I think that this is maybe a slight aside here, but I think that there's a deep sentiment, there's a deep temptation among a lot of people to just immediately collapse every single moral argument into either an argument about fairness or an argument about harm, because those are our two strongest moral intuitions. And so, you can make the strongest argument by figuring out a way to show how a particular case leads to an issue of harm or an issue of fairness. Whereas I think that there's a lot of other moral sentiments which people express. There's a big diversity of moral sentiments, and if you try to collapse every single moral argument into harm or fairness, you might be able to win the argument, but you end up in a situation where you're arguing something that isn't really the real reason why you're upset about something. And I think that that's just something that we should look out for. I talk a lot on this channel how you should always say the thing that you really believe in. Always say the position that you actually believe, as opposed to just trying to win a debate, win a gotcha game, as a number of the Democrats are trying to win against the Trump White House with the stimulus check thing. I think we should be careful about that kind of thing. And I think that when it comes to this pandemic, when it comes to this coronavirus thing, we're starting to really see a diversity of moral opinions come forward, and it's interesting to see. It's interesting to watch how these debates unfold. So anyway, if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.